We're going to talk a little bit about bee biology. Y'all thought you were done with biology class, but we've got a lot to cover here because our bees are living things and we want to keep them that way. And not only are the bees themselves alive, of course, but they're interacting with everything else in the environment, all the flowering plants out there. And so as a beekeeper, you are going to become an expert botanist as well. You're going to be driving down the road and you're going to see something pink and you're going to say to yourself, what the heck is that flower? I haven't seen that bloom. Is there a bee on that? Should I plant some of that in my yard? You're going to be inspecting everybody's flower gardens. Is there a bee on that? I need to get some of those. You're going to start taking an informal survey of every plant that you see. So you don't have to necessarily know all of this stuff that I'm going to cover to keep bees, but it's going to make beekeeping make a lot more sense when you understand what's going on in the bees and how they interact with each other. We kind of talk about a bee colony as a superorganism. So an organism is one individual living thing. But a superorganism, this bee colony, it's a collection of thousands of individuals, 30, 40, 50,000 bees living in a hive, but they act as they're one unit. So we kind of think of them like a superorganism. They collect food together. The bees that are alive right now, collecting all of this spring honey, most of the honey that they're going to need for the rest of the year are going to be collected in the next couple of months. These bees today are going to be long dead before the winter bees are eating all of that honey. But because of the way they work to support their family, their colony, their queen, they're willing to do all of that work in order that their colony can continue and can survive through the winter, even though the spring bees will be long gone. Of course, bees also will defend themselves very effectively, and we know what that feels like probably. If you've never been stung by a bee, there is a very slight chance that you could be allergic to bees. It's rare, but it is possible. If that's something that happens to you, this is not the hobby for you. You need to carry around an EpiPen and be very careful. If you've been stung by a wasp and had a bad reaction, it does not necessarily mean that you would be allergic to bees. Everybody swells up, everybody itches, it drives you crazy for a few days. That's called a histamine reaction. A true bee allergy, your throat swells up and you need to go straight to the hospital. So do be careful. Bees also reproduce as a group, as a unit. The whole entire colony splits in half. Half the bees move out and half the bees stay behind. And this is something that we're starting to see already this year, and we're going to see more and more of it over the next month or so. Some groups don't get along very well, but bees do. They don't argue about whose turn it is to do what. There's a job that needs to be done. The bees simply do it. They're social animals. They need each other. They're not happy unless there's another bee stepping on their heads. Most bee species are solitary, but honeybees live together in these huge groups, and they can accomplish such amazing things. They can produce all this honey. They can make all this beeswax, and they can create these enormous colonies. But they need each other to do it. They don't behave like other types of livestock. You can't fence in a bee. You could, but you'd need an enormous fence because they have a very large territory. They come and go as they please, and they really take care of their own needs for the most part. Most of the problems that are associated with honeybees and beekeeping right now are all man-made problems. It's habitat loss. There's so few wild areas left with flowers to support bees. All the parasites and diseases and pests of the beehive have all been imported into this country from other places because, of course, the bees are not from around here either. But they take care of their own needs. They go and get food. They make much better beekeepers than we do in a lot of ways. We can manage them in these hives that we provide for them, but remember, that's for our convenience, not necessarily for the bees. We can take a portion of their surplus honey as long as we leave them enough to last through the next winter. They're very efficient at what they do. If in doubt, trust the bees. If you can't figure out what the bees are trying to do, more than likely, they're doing what they need to do. They know what they need, and they're trying to correct a mistake that we may have made. So if you want to be a good beekeeper, Learn to work with the bees and not against them. That's kind of the opposite of what man does with nature a lot of times. We conquer nature, we pave over it, we exploit everything, right? But the bees have very specific goals in mind at different parts of the year. Right now, the bees are trying to build up their population. They're taking advantage of all the spring flowers to gather as much food as they can, to reproduce as fast as they can. Then the colony wants to split. Half of it can move off and form a new colony. That's just how their species does it. And then they want to still have enough time for both halves to build up again. So if we want to manage them for swarms, we can split the colony right now. We can move half the bees to another box, and you can have 2 colonies. It doesn't work that way with other livestock. You don't cut a chicken in half and have 2 chickens. But you can do this with bees. You can split that whole colony. We add extra honey supers to the colonies this time of year because this is the time of year that they are storing up so much honey. So there's different things that they want to do at different times of year, and we want to help them to do that. And so that's what we want to really focus on right now. These are the 3 bees. These are the 3 bees that you're going to see inside of your colony. Each of these 3 honeybees has a very important job, or they have very important jobs to do. The first one is the queen bee. The queen is the heart of the hive. We can't have a hive for very long without a good queen bee. She is obviously a female bee. She's the only reproductive female. There's 1 per colony, usually. Occasionally you will see more than 1 queen in a colony. Some people say up to 10% of the colonies have multiple queens, but that's a temporary condition, and usually they correct that. But this queen bee is the mother of all the other bees in the hive. So all the drones, all the worker bees, think about Mother's Day in there. 50,000 bees in a hive, 1 mommy. She's got to open up all those little tiny cards, macaroni necklaces and things like that. Yeah. She can lay more than 1,000 eggs a day, sometimes up to 1,500 eggs a day in the springtime. When the weather is right, when there's lots of flowers in bloom, she's laying like crazy. Your chickens can't do that. Of course, you would have to feed your hen 800 pounds of corn every day in order to get her to do that, because this queen bee, in order to lay that many eggs, she is constantly metabolizing food, and she is being fed constantly, many times her own body weight every day to maintain this level of egg laying. She doesn't do this all year. It ramps up in the spring and the summer, and then it kind of tapers off. In the winter, she may not lay at all for a while, then she starts up again in the spring. But she has to feed continuously in order to do that. And the only food she ever eats is royal jelly. How would you like to put that on a sandwich with some peanut butter? You probably wouldn't. It's not very tasty. They actually put it in a lot of cosmetics. It's supposed to be wonderful for your skin, but it's very labor intensive to harvest it. But if that's something that you wanted to do, it's another product from your beehive that you could collect. But royal jelly is a super nutritious food. It's full of protein and amino acids and vitamins and all kinds of energy and lipids. So it's everything a bee needs. It's a complete diet. It's basically everything in pollen with the undigestible parts removed. So the workers eat a lot of pollen, they metabolize into this royal jelly, and they feed it to the queen. They also feed it to their younger sisters. So it's kind of analogous to how mammals make milk to feed their young, but in this case, the young are feeding their mother. There must be something to her diet because she is the longest living bee. She can live up to 10 times as long as any other bee. They say they can live up to 5 years, but if you can get 2 or 3 good years out of a queen, you've done very well. Usually we lose queens when they swarm and they fly off and we don't see them again, or they replace their queen on their own after a little while, and we'll talk more about that here in a minute. Most of the bees in the hive are workers. So at least 90% of the bees in the hive should be worker bees. These are all females, but they're non-reproductive females. So they've chosen not to reproduce in order to take on all these other tasks. So the ladies have to do all the work in the hive. Can you believe that? I always hear some ladies mumble, yes. They do all the different jobs. They do all the housework. They clean the house. A beehive is immaculately clean. They tend to the brood. So the worker bees do all the babysitting. They take care of their little sisters. They feed them, they change their tiny little larval diapers, all that stuff. And they take care of their mom. They groom her, they feed her, they make sure she doesn't need anything. And they secrete beeswax, and they build all the honeycombs. They also regulate the temperature inside the hive. They keep the brood nest at a very precise temperature to incubate those eggs and to raise those larvae. And they pollinate. So anytime you see a bee outside on a flower, a honeybee, that's a female bee doing that work. So they go out and they gather the pollen, they gather the nectar, they do all the grocery shopping, then they bring it home and they do all the cooking as well. So only the female bees make honey. And if you've ever been stung by a bee, that was one of the ladies too. Only female bees can sting. A queen bee has an ovipositor, so to deposit eggs. On the workers, it's modified into a stinger, but it's just a modified ovipositor, so they use that to defend the hive. A drone bee does not have a stinger. He wouldn't be equipped with that at all. Drones are the male bees. They're all, we say they're reproductive males. They're potentially reproductive. Maybe 1 in 1,000, if he's lucky, will actually get a chance to complete the one task that nature has given him, but they don't do any of those other jobs. They basically sit around with their feet up, drinking honey and watching the sports channel in the hive. And then on a nice day, they fly around outside with one thing on their mind. They can't sting. They're not even equipped for that. The only purpose nature has given them is to find a queen bee and mate with her. And then they die. Nature is very efficient. So once that job is complete, he's out of the way. Most of the bees, of course, most of the drones don't get to do that, so they come back to the hive, watch some more sports, drink some more honey. When they get hungry, they just stop a worker bee and say, hey, I need a refill. And then their sisters say, here you go, here, have some nectar. Room service. They're very polite about it. But at the end of the season, they get rid of those drones. They couldn't even do that one thing they were trying to do all year long, and so they just boot them out of the hive and they wind up dying. They freeze to death or they get eaten by something else. So a drone thinks he's got a pretty good life for a while. This is the queen bee, the big one in the middle. You can recognize her by her crown there. Nature has evolved a bee with a bright yellow dot on her back so we can spot her. How convenient is that, right? Actually, there's a secret code beekeepers use. This is the International Queen Marking Color Code. Not everybody uses it, but if you were to follow that, you could tell how old your bee is, how old your queen bee is. So this is 2022. The year ends in a 2, so this year's queens will be marked in yellow. If you open up a hive and you see a white dot, it's from last year. If you see a blue queen, it's from 2020. If you see a green one, wow, that's from 2019. That is one old bee. If you can still find a red one, that is a super old grandma bee there, but chances are you're not going to see one that old. But we rotate the same colors every 5 years. So as I said, not everybody uses that. A lot of times they just paint them all white, or if you're like me, whatever color you happen to have in the pocket of your bee suit left over from last year, you're not going to go back and find another one, so you just mark them with whatever you've got. They're just standard paint pens you can buy at a hobby shop. You can buy them in the beekeeping catalogs. They're water-based, non-toxic, but when you mark one, it does take a few seconds for the queen to dry. Otherwise, you put her back in the hive and they wipe it all off. You can buy these little devices like this to capture a queen, and you push her in there and you can mark her, and you can actually injure her if you're not being careful about that, but they sell all kinds of little devices like that to mark them, or you can just pick them up in your bare hands and you can slap a coat of paint on the top, and that's really the easiest way to do it. You grab her by the wings, so you see her on the comb, you grab her by both wings, because you got a comb in the other hand, you got to put that down. Then you grab her by both back legs and let go of her wings. Never grab her by the front legs. And never grab her by one back leg, because she can spin around and you might accidentally pull a leg off. But if you got both legs, hold them firmly but gently, and then you can mark them. Or you can hold her like this, where you hold her by the thorax, that middle part. Never squeeze her head and never squeeze her abdomen, because you will break all the egg-laying machinery in there if you're not careful. So that's why I like to do the back legs. But a queen bee goes for about $35, $40. Did you ever think you'd pay $40 for a bug? You will if you injure your queen and you need another one in a hurry. So you have to be really careful when you're handling your queens. So what most people should do is practice on drones until you're comfortable with it. Drones are humongous and they can't sting. So you can just grab them all day and paint them different colors and drop them back in the hive. So they're great to practice with. Just don't paint them the same color as your queen or you will mistake them for your queen. Now, all of the larvae in the hive were fed on royal jelly for the first 3 days. From the time they hatch out of their egg until they're about 3 days old, the workers just dump royal jelly in there. They have a gland in their head and they just spit it out. Room service. These bees go around all day, every day, from cell to cell. Are you hungry? Have some food. Are you hungry? Have some food. And they know exactly what to feed that bee larva by the pheromones. We talked about pheromones earlier. We'll get to that in a minute, but they know exactly what to feed it. But when you see these little larvae that look like they're floating in a little pool of goo, that's royal jelly. And if you can see that in a hive, everything is good. Even if you were to kill the queen today, when you put that last frame in, sometimes you feel crunch and you think to yourself, uh-oh, I squished a bee. You feel bad, and then you wonder, I wonder if it was that one important bee out of 40,000. No, what are the odds? And then next time you realize, oh, my queen's missing. Well, it couldn't have been me. But that does happen occasionally. But if you've got larvae floating in royal jelly, that's okay. They can raise another queen. After 3 days, they switch it to a diet called bee bread. When the bees store pollen inside these cells, layer and layer and layer of pollen packed down in there, we call it bee bread. And as I said earlier, it's packed around the brood nest, so it's convenient to feed them. So after these are 3 days old, the drones and workers are fed on bee bread, but if they continuously feed a female larva on royal jelly, then it will develop into a queen bee. So there's no genetic difference between a queen bee and a worker bee. Any female egg can grow up to be queen. So any female has the potential to become a queen bee. And queen bees are raised in these long vertical cells. So they kind of have this bumpy texture like a peanut. A lot of times they're found on the edge of a comb, but they can also draw out a regular cell. It's got a larva in it. They decide that one needs to be the new queen. They'll add more wax and they'll draw it out, and then they'll make it longer like this one and seal it up on the end. And they just pack that in with royal jelly, full of food in there. So if you see these long cells, your hive is trying to raise a queen, and you might need to figure out why. Was it something you did? Is it something they think they need to be doing? They're not going to raise they're not going to raise any queens if they've got a good, healthy queen there. But under certain circumstances, they will. And there's 3 reasons that they're going to raise a new queen. So this answers your question. If the queen they have is considered to be poor quality, then the workers replace her with a process we call supersedure. And they judge the quality of their queen by the amount of queen pheromone that she's producing. So if your mom doesn't smell right, she doesn't smell as good as she used to, you kill her and replace her, right? You promote one of your sisters to be the new mom. That makes sense, right? It would if you were a bee. Now, if you have a great queen and times are good and there's food everywhere and there's so much food coming in and there's so many babies being born that there's not room to have any more, then the queen actually initiates this process called swarming, and she starts the process. She actually we'll get into this later, but she directs them on how to start some new queen cells, and then she leaves the hive and takes about 2/3 of the bees with her, and the queen cell develops, and that new queen inherits a hive that's already full of food and already full of workers, and she just steps right in and takes over. And the last one is, if the queen disappears or dies suddenly, whether it was your fault or it was regicide, who knows, but for whatever reason that queen was raptured away, then the bees in that hive recognize the fact that there is no queen pheromone. There is no queen, and they will start the process of creating new queen cells within hours. Because if they wait too long, every larva in that hive is going to be too old to become a queen. So they have to do it very quickly. And so they'll find larvae that are still under 3 days old, have only been fed royal jelly, and they'll pick a whole bunch of them. We don't know how or why. They go eeny, meeny, miny, mo. They draw straws. You, and you are going to be the new potential queens. And they'll try to raise a whole bunch of them at once. Because if they don't do it right away, then they're going to miss that opportunity. They'll become hopelessly queenless, and that whole colony will die out. You can raise queens. If you want to, you can raise queens and you can sell them to other beekeepers. You can sell $30 bugs, believe it or not. You need to manipulate your colony to make the right conditions. So you need a colony that is queenless, and it has to have a lot of food. It takes a lot of pollen, a lot of protein, and also it takes a lot of sugar, so a lot of honey in there, or you can feed them sugar syrup. And you need a lot of young nurse bees. So we'll get to that in a second, but the younger bees are the ones that are taking care of the brood, taking care of the queen, and can produce a lot of royal jelly. And of course, you have to give them eggs or tiny little larvae. A professional bee breeder will actually use a tool called a grafting tool or grafting needle, pick up that microscopic little larva that's less than a millimeter long, and scoop it out and move it into a little wax cup or a little plastic cup. And when you put it in a hive the right way, they'll turn them into queens, and you can raise hundreds of them at a time if you know what you're doing. But they're going to start that process, and they're going to raise them into queens on their own. They know what to do, and they're going to do it when we provide all the conditions that are just right. Mating and reproduction among bees was never really well understood for a long time because it doesn't happen in the hive. It happens far away, a mile or more away from the hive and high in the air. For many years they thought drones wandered around on the comb and fertilized the eggs in the comb. They didn't know what was going on, but they finally figured it out. So this drone, he's a big burly bee. He's got kind of a big square thorax, very muscular because he spends all of his time flying. On sunny days, he goes out to these places called drone congregation areas with all of his buddies, with bees from lots of different hives in the area. There's a very specific area that they all gather in, and they fly around in big circles, and they wait for a queen to fly by. And nobody's really sure exactly what makes up a drone congregation area, but they're in the same locations every year. So if you find one, you can come back next year and there's a bunch of drones hanging out there again. But this year's drones all die out at the end of the summer, and next year's drones automatically find these same places. We don't understand exactly how it happens. A lot of people are studying that right now. But when a new queen emerges from her queen cells, she's called a virgin queen, after a couple days in the hive, she gets up the nerve to take flight, and she goes out, and she also finds these drone congregation areas. We don't know how, but she knows what to do, and she actually flies twice as far away to avoid her brothers at the nearest drone congregation areas. She will fly to one much farther away to avoid inbreeding. Pretty amazing. She will mate with numerous drones over the course of a couple of days. In the process of doing so, those drones chase her down, and it takes about 1 second for him to do his job, and he loses a significant part of his anatomy and falls on the ground and dies. They clearly did not run this by the drones when they came up with this plan, but they all seem eager to do it. I love this cartoon here. But the next drone that comes along has the added challenge of removing what's known as the mating plug from the drone previous to him. The queen may go back to the hive, she may feed, she may come back out again. The average is 14.6, so around 15 different drones that she mates with, but it could be anywhere from 1 to up to 40. They've done genetic analyses on queens and found that they can mate with up to 40 different drones. They don't need to. One drone provides enough sperm for that queen for the rest of her life, But when she mates with lots of different drones, it actually creates a healthier colony because the offspring in that colony have a lot of genetic variation, and so they are more likely to be resistant to different diseases and other conditions. So inside of her body, she has this little organ, this tank, so to speak, called a spermatheca. So the genetic contribution of all those different drones mixes and mingles in there, and as she lays an egg, she's got these huge ovaries constantly producing eggs, and as each egg is deposited, she fertilizes it on the way out. So she mates for a couple of days. Early in her life, she goes back to the hive and she never leaves again. If you look at a worker and a queen together, they're about the same size except for that humongous abdomen, and that's because it's all this egg-making stuff in there. As she lays an egg, as I said, she can fertilize it as it's deposited, but she doesn't have to. If she does, it becomes a worker bee, or potentially another queen bee. So it's a female if it's fertilized, but an unfertilized egg still develops into a drone. Drones have half as many chromosomes as queen bees. It's called haplodiploidy sex determination. Big long word for something that's just really odd. This is not unique to bees. A lot of ants and wasps and other insects also do this. But it's just one of those curious things about bees. So that means that drones don't have a father, but they've got a grandpa. That makes sense, right? Because his mother had a father. The queen had a father. She came from a fertilized egg, but he doesn't have a father of his own. He has no good father figure in his life, which probably explains his behavior. But the worker bees, of course, they've never met their father. He died 1 second after he mated, so they still have a good work ethic. After mating, though, the queen returns to the hive, and she spends the rest of her life there laying eggs and producing pheromones, and she will never leave home again unless next year she decides to swarm, and then she's outside with a bunch of her offspring for a couple of days until they find a hollow tree to move into. Then she'll go right back to work. The drones, of course, they die immediately after mating, or they get ejected from the hive before winter comes. So the workers wake up one day and they say, you know what? There's no more flowers in bloom. Winter's coming. We're not going to be making any more queens this year. We're going to stick with the one we got. Let's get rid of these deadbeat guys. And they stop feeding them, so they get weak from starvation. After a day or two, they're hungry, and they just start punching and kicking and driving them towards the exit. And they run them all outside, and then they stand guard at the front door and don't let the drones back in. And if you see them there looking so sad, you can scoop up a handful of drones, because you've still got that neighbor who's not quite sure about your new hobby. Put a bunch in your shirt pocket, and you see your neighbor over there. You walk over, hey, Bob, what's going on? And they start walking out all over you. Shake my hand, because they can't sting you. They're just drones, and they'll be weak anyway. So they're on their way out. You can have fun with them. You can take a drone and you can tie a little piece of thread around its waist very gently. Get about 1.5 feet, and you tie that onto a safety pin, and you put that on your kids before they go to school for show and tell. Everybody loves a drone on a leash. You'll get your safety pin back at the end of the day, but there won't be a bee on it. There'll be a note on it. I'm not going to tell you how I know that. Worker bees. So, the queen lays an egg. It sits there for about 3 days, then it hatches. It's a larva for 6 days. It's a hungry eating machine. That's all it does. It eats royal jelly for 3 days, it eats bee bread for 3 days, and then it says, whoa, I am full. I couldn't eat another bite. Go ahead and seal up my cell. So they seal it up, and then it spends about 12 days in the pupal stage, completely reorganizing its entire body. It basically turns to mush and reorganizes and forms itself into an adult and emerges 21 days later. So it takes 3 weeks to go from egg to adult bee. That's important to know if you're trying to figure out different things in the hive and how to make more bees. A worker bee lives about 4 to 6 weeks in the spring, the summer. They work themselves to death. They didn't get a good union. They don't have a good retirement plan. They fly till they die. In the wintertime, they can live 4 to 6 months because they're not flying. They're hanging out inside the hive, and they stay relatively inactive and they live a lot longer. Drones pupate in 15 days, so they stay in that pupal stage an extra 3 days, so it takes 24 days to make a drone. That doesn't seem like it's very significant, but it can be very useful when we talk about this critter. This is the horrid varroa mite. Varroa mites know that they attack bees in the pupal stage. And they know that if they get into a cell with a drone instead of a worker, then they've got an extra 3 days to reproduce. They only reproduce on live bee brood. And so that she can have more baby mites if she gets into a drone cell. And they know that, and they can tell the difference, and they prefer to move into the drones, and we can use that behavior against the mites. So we'll talk about that a little bit in our third lesson. But drones live for 1 season, then they die, and somehow the queen, of course, can just stop making boys, and then next spring, she can start making them again. So she can choose whether to fertilize that egg or not, and so she won't even have drones in the hive in the winter. Your queen pupates very quickly. She can develop in 7 days in that cell, so go for a total of 16 days from egg to adult. So if you see those sealed cells inside of queen cells inside your hive, within a week, that's going to hatch out and become another queen. And of course, she could live for several years, as we said. Now, your workers perform different tasks according to their age. So the youngest bees are called nurse bees, and their tasks are very safe. Down in the brood nest where they hatched out, they do some house cleaning, they snuggle the little larva, they feed it a little bottle, give it some royal jelly, they give it some pollen. When they get a little bit older, they start making beeswax, they build combs, they repair combs, they move nectar around the hive. Then they start moving toward the entrance. They spend a day on guard duty. You're a guard bee. Your job is to be near the front door, make sure that nobody tries to get in who doesn't belong here. If they do, you sting them and then you die. Good luck. We salute you. If you survive your day or two on guard duty, then you become a field bee or a forager. And this is the most dangerous job of all because anything can happen out there. If you're lucky, you might live 2 weeks. The average is about 7 days. That means if some bees can live 14 days, that means other bees die on the first trip out of the hive. But the average is about 7 days. You might get eaten by a bird or fly into a spider's web, or you might have to sting somebody and die. You might get hit by a truck crossing the highway. Anything can happen. So they don't live very long, but they just keep going as long as they can. Let's take a look at honeybee anatomy, and you'll realize how truly amazing some of these creatures are. They've got wings, like most insects. Most insects have 4 wings, 2 pairs of wings, and honeybees do too. So they've got one in the front and one in the back on each side, but bees have a row of hooks that connect the hind wing to the front wing, and they lock it together. And so it functions as 2 large wings instead of 4 little ones, but then when they get back to the hive, they can unhook them and fold them all back out of the way. So easy storage. There's the bee's knees. You've always heard that phrase. Now you know what they're talking about. If you look at bees' legs, they're all different. Each pair of legs is different because a bee is like a Swiss Army knife. Everywhere on a bee, there's some new tool that flips out and does some different tasks. Bees are specialists and generalists. They know how to do all the jobs, but they only do one at a time as they age. And so you can see all the different attachments on their legs. They've got big compound eyes made up of lots of little tiny eyes. They got hairs growing out of the middle of their eyes, but each one has about 8,500 lenses on each side of their head. It wraps around. They can see in almost every direction at once. You can't sneak up on a bee. They can see all the colors you can see except red. Bees don't see that color, but they can see ultraviolet light. And most flowers actually reflect UV light in the middle. We call them nectar guides. It's invisible to us because you can't see UV light. You see a yellow dandelion, but to a bee there's a bullseye there in the middle that tells them exactly how to approach that flower, where to land, and where to find the nectar. So it's invisible to us, but there's an extra color bees can see. We don't really know what the world looks like to them, but they can see things that we can't. Now, Vision is very important, but so is their sense of smell. And their antennae are where the sense of smell is located on a honeybee. And each of those antennae are covered with specialized cells that allow them to pick up trace amounts of odors that we cannot smell. Bees can smell better than the best bloodhound out there, much better than dogs. And actually the military has experimented with honeybees for sniffing out explosives at checkpoints. Honeybees can be trained to find landmines buried in the ground. So you can do a lot with a bee. Because their antennae are so important, they have this special little attachment here on their front leg. There's the bee's knee again, and on the back side is this notch, and this little spur here. They can pinch their antenna inside that and draw it through like a squeegee. It cleans off their antenna, like a windshield wiper or something. And so they've got a built-in antenna cleaner. Most insects have to lick or nibble on their antenna to clean them, but the Hymenoptera, the bees, wasps, and ants have this special little attachment called a stridulus that they use to clean their antenna. Beeswax comes from wax glands on the underside of the bee's abdomen down here. So if you ever lit a candle made out of beeswax, if you ever nibbled on a piece of comb honey, it started out here in a bee's belly button. Thousands of little flakes of wax produced by thousands of bees. They work together and they use their mouth parts, their mandibles. They open sideways like a pair of pliers, and they shape those little flakes of wax into those perfect little hexagons that we call honeycombs. So they use their mandibles for all kinds of things. They pick up dead bees and drag them out of the hive. They bite intruders to get rid of them. They can actually tag an intruder with alarm pheromone using a special gland on their mouths as well, instead of just stinging them. Behind those jaws is a long tongue. So this tongue can probe way down into the bottom of the flower to get the nectar. Meanwhile, all of these stamens on the flower are depositing pollen all over the bee's body, which they carry to the next flower. But they make the bee work for that. They've got to probe down inside with their long tongue to get the sweet stuff. Some bees have super long tongues. Look at this guy. Why would you need a tongue like that? Because that bee specializes in orchids. Orchid bees have long tongues because orchid flowers have a long corolla, and it needs it to be able to get the nectar way down inside. If it weren't for this bee, this flower couldn't be pollinated. But if it wasn't for this flower, that bee would have nothing to eat. They need long tubular flowers in order to feed. So nature has provided a perfect combination of lock and key there. Now, if this flower goes extinct, that bee may disappear. If that bee goes extinct, that flower may disappear. So they're perfectly specialized for each other, whereas our honeybees are generalists. Wherever we put them, they can usually find some kind of flower that they can feed on. But others are highly specialized for a very specific type of flower. Inside, bees have two stomachs. So they have one kind of a big stretchy bag at the bottom of their esophagus called a honey crop or a honey stomach. And then they have a regular stomach where they digest their dinner. In between, there's a little muscular gate called a proventriculus that they can squeeze together and kind of lock it. Now, as bees visit 100 different flowers on each trip outside the hive, they get a little drop of nectar from each one. They store it in the honey crop, and they bring it back to the hive, and they can squeeze it together and spit out that nectar. It does not go down into their stomach, and so they don't digest it. But if they're out long enough, they can open that valve, and they can let a little bit of nectar go through, and they can digest that for energy. And this thing right here has little teeth on it. It can actually reach up and grab pollen grains and push them down into its proper stomach. That's why this is all yellow here. It cleans the pollen out of the nectar, and it digests the pollen on the trip back to the hive. So when it goes to deposit the nectar in the hive, most of the pollen has been removed. It's much cleaner. Amazing. Now, it doesn't just go and spit that nectar into a honeycomb, because that would be gross. She gathers a bunch of those younger sisters around and she passes the nectar to a group of them, maybe 5 or 10 or 15 bees. She distributes that load of nectar to each one, and those bees stand there with their long tongues out and accept that nectar, and they slurp it in and they say, "Oh, that's delicious." And then they'll spit it back out and slurp it in and spit it back out. And you'll see bees sometimes working a drop of nectar. And this process, because they break the big drop of nectar into smaller ones, it increases the surface area and it evaporates a lot of the moisture out of that nectar. So the bees will work the nectar for 10, 15 minutes, and they get rid of a lot of moisture. They're also adding special enzymes that chemically break the sugar molecules in half into 2 different sugars. And then after they've worked it for a while, then they will go and deposit that nectar into honeycomb cells. It's ripening, but it's not ripe yet. So that still has too much moisture in it. It's unripe nectar. Now the bees all line up in one direction and they fan their wings really fast, and it blows a current of air across the surface of the comb and continues to evaporate that moisture out. And then when it's just right, the bees seal up each individual cell as it becomes ripe. They have to get it down to about 18.6% moisture. When it gets to that point, the naturally occurring yeasts that are everywhere in the air, in the hive, all over the place, cannot become active. If there's too much moisture, then those yeasts become active and that nectar would ferment in the hive. So also, it takes up much less volume when they remove all the moisture, so it's much more efficient for the bees to store honey than nectar because it takes up about 1/3 of the space. So they do all of this work to can their food to keep it around for wintertime. Now, next time you're enjoying a spoonful of honey on a nice buttery biscuit, you can think about how that spoonful of honey has been in and out and in and out and in and out and in and out and in and out of hundreds of different bees before it ever made it to your table. Usually somebody gets up and walks out when I get to that point. Now, one individual worker bee works her whole entire life and produces about 1/12 of a teaspoon of honey. But thousands of bees working together can produce hundreds of pounds of honey in a good season when everything works out just right. So that's where honey comes from. People pay you big money for that. Like, you don't necessarily want to watch bacon being made, but that doesn't make it any more less delicious, right? So now, bees have stripes on their abdomen, and that is a warning. Whenever you see yellow and black stripes on anything, that's a warning. Danger. In this case, armed and dangerous. This is a honeybee stinger close up. Other types of bees, bumblebees, other species of bees, wasps, hornets, they have smooth stingers. But a honeybee has a barbed stinger. It's like a fish hook. It goes in and does not come out, which is unfortunate for that one bee that stung you because she's essentially disemboweled. But what's going on here is amazing. So it's got a sharp little needle that sticks in you, but there's a lot here. This is a venom sac. It's tiny. It's like smaller than a sesame seed, but there's enough venom in there to kill some people who are truly allergic to bees. And there's a muscle here in the middle that continues to pump all that bee venom down through the shaft and into your skin. And it continues to operate even though it's been disconnected from the bee. So if you get stung, check it out. You can see it throbbing back and forth because you got nothing better to do when you're stung by a bee, right? Hey, look at that. Show it to your friends. No, you want to get that out of your skin as quickly as possible to minimize the amount of venom that goes in. Now, if your friend gets stung by a bee, say, hey, stop, check that out. You can look at it on them. But when it's your skin, that's different. So this thing is you can actually see there tiny little drops of bee venom that are squirting out of the end of that. But this will go for a while. If you're stung by a bee, you want to scrape the stinger out as quickly as possible. Of course, if you're standing at your beehive, one of your hands has a hive tool in it. That's the perfect tool. Then you smoke that area to cover up that pheromone. But if you aren't at your beehive, you're out in your garden or whatever, somebody else gets stung by a bee, pull out your credit card, your driver's license, something like that, a long fingernail, a pocket knife, scrape sideways. Never try to grab it and squeeze it and pull it out, because when you're trying to get a grip on it, it's working like a turkey baster and you're just squirting all that bee venom directly in your skin. So you don't want to do that. Scrape it out. But when you see a big old fuzzy bee, you just want to give it a hug, don't you? Like a big old fluffy puppy or something like that. Well, all insects have hairs on their bodies. Most of the hairs are for sensing their environment. They're in a hard shell, right? They have an exoskeleton. So like whiskers on a cat, so they can tell when things are close to their faces. So a lot of insects can feel things in the environment, but on a bee, each individual hair is unique. It's fluffy and feathery. We call them plumose hairs. And this helps the pollen grains to stick to the bees. Pollen that's designed to be carried by bees is usually very rough textured and spiky like this. And the bee doesn't like to necessarily be covered in pollen, so she combs her hair. Her front legs, don't laugh, her front legs have special big bristles on them that are nice and stiff, and it works like a brush, and she grooms herself and combs all the pollen off of her body. But remember, pollen is very valuable stuff. It's got lots of nutrients in it, and she wants to take it home, so she puts it in her pollen baskets on her back legs. So maybe you've seen bees that look like they're wearing big yellow, like those leg warmers that people wore in the 80s. Remember those? They got these big yellow things around their back legs. Those are pollen pellets. If you look at the bee's back leg, this is the corbicula, or the pollen basket. It's concave like a spoon, and it's got thick hairs on the edges. These are individual grains of pollen here. Pollen is like a nut. It's got a hard shell on the outside, but inside it's full of protein and vitamins and everything that a bee needs. And so they collect it all, they bring it back, and this is a wind-pollinated plant, like a pine tree. Have you noticed all the pollen all over the hood of your car lately? That's because the oak trees are blooming and they just have to dump billions of pollen grains everywhere. Very inefficient. Much more efficient to produce a little bit of sugary nectar and invite the bees in with a colorful flower blossom and then slap them with these spiky pollen grains because they get stuck on the bee's fur, and it's basically like flying Velcro. This bee has been in the pumpkin patch. She's covered in pumpkin pollen, but as she goes from one flower to the next, she drops off a little, she picks up a little more, then she'll stop and comb her hair so she looks good when she comes back to the hive. She packs it all on her back legs. Sometimes they'll take off and fly around and then land and groom again. I think maybe it's too heavy on one side. They'll move a little bit. Otherwise, they would just fly in a circle, So off she goes. She comes back to the hive and she deposits that pollen in there. But look at all those different colors. They're from different species of flowers. So you'll see all different colors of pollen in your hive. But each pellet is one uniform color, isn't it? And that's because honeybees and most bees will only visit one species of flower on each trip outside the hive. So if she's been working the pumpkin patch, she will go from pumpkin flower to pumpkin flower to pumpkin flower. If she's in your peach trees, she will go from peach blossom to peach blossom to peach blossom. She will not go over to a raspberry, then to a buttercup, hit the rose bush, off to the clover, and then back to the peach tree, because that would be a waste. That pollen would not go to the right species of plant. So we call this flower fidelity or flower constancy, and it's what makes bees such efficient pollinators for a lot of our crops. They carry it home, she finds a cell, she turns around and kicks those pellets in there, and then she uses the top of her head and smashes them down nice and flat. So I don't know if you remember earlier I showed a picture, it looked like a bunch of pancakes stacked up inside those cells. And then, of course, they feed that to these big larvae here. Bees maintain a very constant temperature in their hive. In the winter, it gets down to about 80 degrees, but they all cluster together. And so the bees in the middle are generating heat. They have two wing muscles. One pulls the wing up, one pulls the wing down, and they feed on that sugary rich honey, and it gives them a lot of energy, And when they flex both muscles at once, their thorax kind of vibrates and it generates a tiny bit of heat. Just like you, when you get cold, you shiver, right? And it generates a tiny bit of heat in your muscles and you warm up a little bit. So bees are doing the same thing. But here you've got 10,000 bees doing it at the same time, and it actually raises the temperature. All these other bees around them are not lazy. They're forming an insulating layer that keeps all the heat trapped in. If they overheat, the cluster will loosen up and chimney off some of that hot air. If they get cool, they come back together in a real tight cluster. And the whole entire cluster moves upward in the hive. That's why they put the honey in the top. Heat rises, the bee cluster moves up, and they consume the honey as they go. The bees in the middle get tired and they wiggle out to the outside of the cluster and rest. The bees on the outside end up in the middle of the cluster and they warm up and they take turns generating heat. And so all winter long they go in and out and the whole cluster moves up and it gets bigger and smaller, and it's a very dynamic process. In the spring they start to lay eggs again and they produce brood, and they keep the brood nest about 92, 93 degrees. The perfect temperature for bees. Just the presence of all those bees keeps them toasty warm. If they need to, they can generate more heat. If they get too hot, a lot of bees just move off to the side. Sometimes in the summer, you'll see a lot of bees on the front of a hive. We call this bearding. This is a sign that your hive does not have good ventilation. It's too stuffy in there. Your bees will create air currents. They line up and they flap their wings and they draw air in and around the hive and back out to bring in fresh air. And this helps to keep it cool. But when the temperature outside is too hot, they'll go down to the creek, they fill up their honey crop with water, they come back and they spit out droplets of water all over the hive, and then they do this fanning and it evaporates the water and brings the temperature down. Some of y'all are old enough to remember the old-fashioned swamp coolers, right? They dripped the water and it kept things cool. Bees invented air conditioning. It's the same process they use to evaporate the moisture from the honey as well. Now, we talked about pheromones. There's a lot of them. We talked about alarm pheromone and why we use the smoke. I talked a little bit about queen pheromone. Each queen has a unique scent, and every bee in the hive recognizes their mother by the way she smells, and she smells different than the hive right next door. We can't tell the difference, but they can. As they feed and groom their queen, they pick up her pheromones off of her body, and they turn around and pass that odor, that chemical, to all the other bees. So these bees turn around and share food with another bee. They share food with other bees and other bees and other bees. As bees come in with nectar and they're exchanging food and passing it around, the queen's pheromones pervade the entire hive. Every bee in the hive gets a dose of the queen pheromone every day. If the queen disappears, like we talked about earlier, suddenly every bee in the hive recognizes there's a lack of pheromone. And this happens within about 4 to 6 hours. They know they're queenless, and this initiates that process where they run around and find tiny larvae and they turn them into queens while they still have a chance. So the absence of queen pheromone induces queen rearing. It also keeps them from swarming. People say older queens tend to swarm more. It's because the older they get, the less pheromone that they produce, and so they tend to swarm more often. It also prevents supersedure. A young, healthy queen produces a lot of pheromone. As she gets older and she's not producing as much, that's when they say, hey, it's time to replace you. So they go over here to the side, they raise a new queen, and they say, yep, our sister looks good, all right, go have that talk with mom. And the queen bee says, well, that's how I got this job in the first place, so she's a pretty good sport about it. And they kill her, and they install their sister as the new queen. If a hive can't requeen itself, that queen pheromone inhibits the worker's ovaries from developing. But if the queen disappears and they can't requeen themselves, then you've got a whole generation of workers that are raised in an environment where there is no queen pheromone, and their ovaries begin to develop and they start to lay eggs, but they aren't very good at it, and they often lay 3, 4, 5 eggs in a cell. Sometimes you'll even see a couple of different larvae in the same cell. This means that that hive is queenless. It's hopelessly queenless. It can be difficult to requeen one of those. But because each of those eggs are unfertilized, because the worker bees can't mate, they all turn into drones. And so all this, they think they're laying worker eggs because they don't know any better, but they all start turning into drones which stick out from the surface of the comb. Each individual larva gives off brood pheromones. It tells the workers how old they are and whether they're male or female and whether they should be a queen or a worker. We call that the caste. And so she's providing room service. She dips her head in there and she knows exactly what to feed that larva and how much. And this is where that varroa mite comes along and says, I'm going to ride around on this worker bee. So there's a couple of them on this bee. She's going to ride around there until she detects a cell that's got just the right larva. It's an older larva, it's ready to be capped off, and that varroa mite hops off in there, waits for them to seal the cell up, and then she goes and starts laying eggs on that larva, which we'll talk about later. Nasonov pheromone. This is an important one. They have a gland here, the tip of their abdomen, this little white stripe here, gives off this odor that smells like lemongrass oil. It's an aggregation signal. It calls lost bees to the hive. If you open up a hive and you stir them up and you shake a lot of bees out that have never been outside before because they're young, you'll notice bees like this at the entrance, creating this pheromone that goes off, and these bees are just flying around at random, lost, and they smell it and they follow it to the source, which is the entrance of their hive. And they recognize their nest mates and they'll all come back in. When you are installing package bees, you dump them all into a colony, you'll see a lot of this. When you catch a swarm and you dump them into a colony, you'll see a lot of this. These bees are all giving off this odor, and they're telling all the bees flying around, hey, this is home, we've got it, we found it, this is the place, everybody come inside here. And while they're in the process of swarming, so this is a swarm, I keep talking about swarms, when they gather together, they produce a lot of this pheromone, it keeps them nice and tight, and when you've got 30,000 bees flying through the air in a cloud the size of a Greyhound bus. They're moving through a forest. They stay together because they're producing a whole lot of this pheromone as well. And when they find a source of water, which may not have a particular smell, they'll give off this odor that helps other bees to find that water source. And so you may see a long creek bank, and you always see bees at one spot. Even though there's room for 1 million bees, the first bee found that spot and she gives off an odor, and so the next bee comes to that spot, and you'll have this aggregation of bees in one spot sometimes. And bees like to dance. You've probably heard about the bee dances. They communicate very specific directions to different resources. How far away, which direction, and how good that food source is based on this little figure-8 dance that the bees are doing. And they give those directions in relation to where the sun is in the sky. They use the same thing when they're talking about which hollow tree to move into when they're out swarming. They're actually dancing around on the surface of the swarm. Check this out.
Honeybees have some fascinating abilities, among them being able to communicate by performing a unique dance. It informs hive mates where a newly discovered food source is located. Every cycle of this waggle dance roughly describes the shape of the figure 8. Let's rewind and look in more detail. The bee only waggles on a part of its route, the straight run, indicated here by the waved line. The secret lies in the direction of the straight run, or to be more precise, in the angle between the straight run and the perpendicular, which in this case is 90 degrees to the left. This tells the other bees that food is available 90 degrees to the left of the sun. If the angle is 60 degrees to the right, they'll be flying at 60 degrees to the right of the sun.
So this tiny little bee is using the sun as a landmark in the sky, but they also know that the sun moves about 15 degrees per hour across the sky, and so all day long they are adjusting that dance according to where the sun has moved. And when a bee flies off, she knows which direction she came from, and she might be out for 15, 20 minutes, and then she has to fly back. She also looks at the sun and she thinks, okay, it's been this long, the sun has moved this far, home used to be that way, so now it's going to be that way. And she does all that trigonometry on the fly as she is out there in the field. So these tiny little bees, she's about 3/4 of an inch long. She goes several miles from home. That's an enormous territory. If you remember your high school geometry, A 2-mile radius is about 8,000 acres, a little bit more. A 3-mile radius is what we really consider to be the limit that a beehive goes. They'll stay within 2 miles as long as there's food, but they can go up to 3 miles and even more than that. But that's 18,000 acres that a beehive has a territory. This is why you don't see any organic honey produced in the U.S. A lot of people like to say their honey is organic, but if you don't have your bees in the middle of 18,000 acres of certified organic farmland, you really shouldn't be marketing your honey as organic. If you buy organic honey, it probably came from either New Zealand or South America. They're about the only places left in the world that have that much land that has never had a fertilizer or insecticide or anything else on it. So I'm going to wrap it up here with a little comparison of this honeybee. How does it stack up against Superman? Who do you think is more amazing? Let's find out. As I said, this bee is about 3/4 of an inch long. Well, apparently Superman is 6'3". That's 75 inches, so he's as tall as 100 bees stacked end to end. So that's very convenient to do the math, so we'll go with that. This little bee can forage up to 3 miles away from her hive. That means Superman would have to patrol a 300-mile radius around the city looking for villains to be just equivalent, proportionally equivalent to that honeybee. She can cruise about 15 miles an hour. If you ever thought you outran a bee, you're kidding yourself. You got far enough away, the bee no longer considered you a threat, and she said, "Yeah, and stay out." And then she flew back home. That means that that little bee can go 3 miles in about 12 minutes. Superman would have to fly 1,500 miles an hour. Is that faster than a speeding bullet? Air density, the temperature, the caliber, you could do all that. But that's about just shy of Mach 2, twice the speed of sound. So I suppose Superman could do that. I'll give him that. But this little bee here, she's got a territory of 28.3 square miles. How big is that? Put that into perspective. Here we are, right here in this building. This is a 3-mile radius around Little Rock. So that observation hive in the other room, my honeybees could be anywhere in this territory any given time. Now chances are they're going to stay close as long as there's food, but they could reach that far away. That doesn't mean that one hive of bees pollinates every flower in town, but they could potentially. Now today, maybe they found all kinds of good flowers over here, and they danced and they told everybody to go over here. Tomorrow, they might find good flowers over here, and they're going to shift all their efforts to wherever they can find the best. Some bees are always scouting the whole area, but they're going to focus their efforts on the best food. They'll fly right over mediocre food growing right outside if there's some really good patch of food farther away. But they're in competition with all of the other beehives in this whole area, and so they've got to find it fast, and they've got to take care of those resources as quickly as they can. So to be equivalent there, Superman has a territory of about 283,000 miles. How big is that? That's slightly larger than Texas. So to put that into perspective, here's our beehive. If this building was a beehive and we were all 6'3" honeybees, in 12 minutes, you could be feasting on flowers under the St. Louis Arch. Or you could be all the way down here in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, or you could be over in Oklahoma City. You could be the other side of Dallas in 12 minutes. Whew, busy as a bee. Aren't they amazing creatures?